The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of forward operating base Shank like a blade through silk. Staff Sergeant Reyna Ghost Castellanos was 3 sips into her bitter coffee when the transmission broke every protocol she'd learned in 8 years of close air support missions. No call sign, no authentication, just a voice, barely human, whispering coordinates that placed 6 Navy SEALs 43 miles deep in Taliban-controlled territory. Any station, the voice rasped, each word bleeding desperation. Multiple KIA, we're down to our last magazine, cannot hold position much longer. The operations center fell silent except for the mechanical hum of electronics. Major Davidson, the Air Operations Center chief, stood frozen with his own coffee cup halfway to his lips. 3 other pilots exchanged glances that said what nobody wanted to voice. Those coordinates were beyond the reach of conventional rescue operations. The mountains rose like jagged teeth from the Afghan landscape, their peaks shrouded in cloud cover that hadn't lifted in 4 days. Weather reports showed deteriorating conditions, with visibility dropping to near zero, above 8,000 feet. Negative rescue authorization, Davidson finally announced, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that haunted officers long after retirement. Weather's too severe. No visual confirmation of friendly positions. We cannot authorize a mission into that terrain. Ghost had already pulled up the tactical display on her tablet, her fingers dancing across the screen with practiced precision. The coordinates burned into her memory like a brand. She recognized the area, a narrow valley where 3 ridgelines converged, creating a natural fortress that was simultaneously perfect for defense and ideal for entrapment. The SEALs were caught in what tacticians called a kill box, surrounded by elevated positions that gave enemy fighters devastating fields of fire. The radio hissed again, weaker this time. Please, anyone, then silence. Ghost set down her coffee with deliberate care, the ceramic mug clicking against the metal table like a decision being made. Around her, other personnel resumed their conversations, but she remained motionless, staring at those coordinates. 8 years of flying the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the ungainly, beloved Warthog, had taught her that sometimes the impossible was just another word for unprofessional. Her aircraft sat on the tarmac outside, its twin engines and distinctive profile designed for exactly this kind of mission. Getting low, getting dirty, and bringing everyone home. Major Davidson was already walking away when Ghost stood, her chair scraping against concrete. "Sir," she called out, her voice carrying across the operations center with quiet authority, "I can reach them." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the silence of defeat, it was the silence before a storm. Davidson turned slowly, his expression shifting from dismissal to something approaching curiosity. Other pilots had stopped their conversations entirely now, sensing the electricity in the air. Ghost felt their attention like spotlight beams, but her focus remained locked on her commanding officer. "Captain Castellanos," Davidson said, using her rank with deliberate formality, "those coordinates place our people in terrain that's been off-limits for good reason. The weather alone—" "I've flown in worse," Ghost interrupted, immediately regretting the breach of protocol but unable to retract it. She took a breath, choosing her words more carefully. "Sir, I've studied every valley in this sector for 3 years. I know the wind patterns, the thermal updrafts, the way the terrain channels airflow. The A-10 can handle what's out there." Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, the squadron operations officer, stepped forward from where she'd been monitoring radio traffic. "The ceiling is dropping by the hour, Ghost. Satellite imagery shows cloud cover building along those ridgelines. Even if you could get in, extraction becomes exponentially more dangerous." Ghost nodded, acknowledging the valid concern while never breaking eye contact with Davidson. "Ma'am, respectfully, the A-10 wasn't designed to fly above the weather. It was designed to fly through it." The major's jaw worked silently for several seconds. Ghost could almost see him weighing variables: mission success probability, political fallout from casualties, the haunting possibility that 6 elite warriors might die while rescue assets remained grounded for bureaucratic reasons. These were the calculations that separated effective commanders from merely competent ones. "Even if I authorized the mission," Davidson said slowly, "you'd be flying solo. No wingman support, no dedicated rescue coordination. If something goes wrong out there, you're on your own." Ghost felt a familiar coldness settle in her chest, not fear, but the peculiar calm that descended when all variables aligned toward a single, inevitable conclusion. She'd felt it before. Over Kandahar when Taliban fighters had pinned down a Marine patrol, over Helmand when a roadside bomb had trapped an army convoy. Each time, the sensation preceded her best work. "Sir," she said quietly, "6 men are dying while we discuss weather reports." The operations center held its collective breath. Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the eastern horizon in shades of copper and gold, but the mountains remained shrouded in darkness. Weather stations reported deteriorating conditions across the operational area, with wind speeds approaching the maximum limits for safe flight operations. Davidson's radio operator, a young airman whose name Ghost had never learned, suddenly straightened at his console. "Sir," he called out, his voice tight with urgency, "we're receiving another transmission from the missing SEAL team." Every person in the operations center turned toward the radio operator as he adjusted his headset with trembling fingers. The static seemed louder now, more aggressive, as if the atmosphere itself was fighting against communication. When the voice finally emerged from the white noise, it carried a finality that chilled everyone present. "This is Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez," the transmission wavered in and out of clarity. "We've taken heavy casualties. Position is compromised. If anyone can hear this, tell our families." The radio fell silent again, but this time the silence felt permanent. Ghost found herself moving toward the equipment lockers before conscious thought caught up with action. Her flight suit hung exactly where she'd left it 6 hours earlier, the patches and worn fabric telling stories of missions that had tested both aircraft and pilot beyond design specifications. "Ghost," Davidson's voice stopped her mid-stride. When she turned, his expression had shifted from bureaucratic concern to something approaching resolve. "If you're going to do this thing, you're going to do it right. Full mission authorization. I'll handle the paperwork and the fallout." Lieutenant Colonel Chen stepped forward, her tablet already displaying weather updates and tactical overlays. "I can coordinate with the Joint Operations Center for intelligence updates. We'll maintain radio contact as long as atmospheric conditions permit." Ghost felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, not relief, but acknowledgement. In 8 years of military service, she'd learned that some missions transcended normal command structures and safety protocols. This was becoming one of those missions, where the chain of command bent under the weight of moral imperative. "Time to mission ready?" Davidson asked. 30 minutes, Ghost replied, already calculating fuel loads, weapon configurations, and approach vectors. "Weather window is closing, but I can work with what's available." The pre-dawn darkness outside seemed less oppressive now, charged with possibility rather than foreboding. Ghost pulled her flight suit from the locker, the familiar weight and texture grounding her in routine even as the mission parameters defied convention. As she dressed, she could hear radio chatter resuming around her, weather updates, coordination calls to nearby units, the mechanical precision of military operations adapting to changing circumstances. But beneath it all, silence stretched from those coordinates 43 miles into hostile territory, where 6 Navy SEALs waited for help that conventional wisdom insisted could never arrive. Ghost zipped her flight suit and reached for her helmet, its scuffed surface bearing the Ghost insignia that had earned her the call sign. In 30 minutes, she would discover whether 8 years of flying the A-10 Thunderbolt II had prepared her for the most challenging mission of her career, or the last mission she would ever fly. The hangar doors were already opening when Ghost reached her aircraft, revealing the pre-dawn landscape beyond forward operating base Shank. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II sat exactly as she'd left it 12 hours earlier, but something about its appearance struck her differently now. The twin engines mounted high on the fuselage seemed more purposeful, the titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit more protective, the massive GAU-8 cannon more reassuring. Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb, her dedicated crew chief, was already performing pre-flight inspections when she arrived. His movements carried the precision of 15 years maintaining close air support aircraft, but Ghost detected subtle signs of tension in his usually steady hands. "Ma'am," Webb said without looking up from the engine cowling, "heard about the mission parameters, loaded her with maximum fuel and a full complement of 30mm rounds. Also took the liberty of mounting 4 AGM-65 Mavericks on the outer pylons." Ghost nodded, running her own visual inspection of the aircraft. The Maverick missiles would provide precision strike capability against hardened positions, while the Warthog's legendary GAU-8 cannon could deliver devastating close air support when friendlies were danger close to enemy positions. But the real advantage of the A-10 wasn't its weapons. It was its ability to operate in conditions that grounded other aircraft. "Weather updates," she asked, pulling on her helmet and adjusting the communications equipment. "Deteriorating faster than predicted," Webb replied, finally meeting her eyes. "Ceiling is dropping below 500 feet in some areas, visibility approaching zero above 8,000 feet elevation." Ghost felt that familiar coldness settling deeper into her chest. The weather conditions would force her to fly below optimal altitude, making the aircraft vulnerable to small arms fire and shoulder-mounted surface-to-air missiles. But the alternative was leaving 6 elite warriors to die, while safer options were debated in comfortable operations centers. "How long since their last transmission?" she asked. 47 minutes, Webb answered quietly. "Nothing since Chief Rodriguez called in casualties." The silence stretching from those coordinates felt heavier now, weighted with implications that Ghost refused to fully acknowledge. In her experience, radio silence from special operations teams rarely indicated improving tactical situations. She completed her walk-around inspection with mechanical precision, checking control surfaces, weapon systems, and engine intakes while her mind processed approach vectors and tactical considerations. The A-10's design philosophy had always appealed to her: simplicity, redundancy, and brutal effectiveness. Unlike sleek fighter jets that relied on speed and altitude, the Warthog succeeded through different principles: toughness, persistence, and the willingness to get close to the fight. Webb handed her the final maintenance log, their brief interaction carrying 8 years of shared missions and mutual respect. "Bring her home, ma'am," he said simply. Ghost strapped herself into the cockpit as the first hints of dawn painted the eastern mountains in shades of rose and amber. The familiar embrace of the ejection seat, the tactical displays coming online, the steady vibration of twin turbofan engines, all of it contributed to a sense of purpose that transcended normal mission parameters. Control Tower cleared her for immediate departure on a heading that would take her directly into the most challenging terrain in the operational area. As the A-10 lifted off, Ghost felt the aircraft settle into its element. Unlike fighters that fought against gravity, the Warthog seemed to collaborate with natural forces, finding lift in unexpected places and stability in conditions that challenged other platforms. The landscape below shifted from the relative civilization around forward operating base Shank to the harsh beauty of the Afghan mountains. Each ridgeline seemed more forbidding than the last, their peaks disappearing into cloud cover that spoke of violence waiting above. Radio contact with the base remained strong during the initial phase of flight, but Ghost knew that would change as she approached the target coordinates. The mountains had a way of swallowing radio transmissions, creating pockets of silence that could isolate aircraft from all outside support. 20 minutes into the flight, she began encountering the weather conditions that had grounded conventional rescue operations. Cloud cover descended like a living thing, pressing down against the landscape with malevolent intent. Visibility dropped in stages, forcing Ghost to rely increasingly on instruments and terrain-following systems that had been designed for exactly these conditions. The A-10 handled the turbulence with characteristic steadiness, its heavy airframe and low-mounted engines providing stability that lighter aircraft couldn't match. But Ghost understood that weather was only the first challenge. The real test would begin when she reached those coordinates and discovered what had happened to 6 Navy SEALs whose radio calls had grown progressively more desperate before falling silent entirely. Her navigation system indicated 15 minutes to target coordinates when everything changed. The clouds parted for perhaps 30 seconds, long enough for Ghost to glimpse the valley where the SEALs were trapped, and long enough for her to understand why conventional rescue operations had been deemed impossible. The terrain below looked like something designed by a tactical genius with homicidal intent. 3 ridgelines converged to create a natural amphitheater where defensive positions overlooked a narrow valley floor. Any rescue helicopter attempting to reach the area would face withering crossfire from multiple elevated positions. But the brief visual also revealed something else: smoke. Thin columns rising from positions along the valley floor that could indicate friendly positions or enemy campfires. Without radio contact, distinguishing between the two would require the kind of low-altitude reconnaissance that turned pilots into targets. Ghost keyed her radio, hopping to re-establish contact with the SEAL team before committing to an approach that would expose her to ground fire. Bravo 6, Bravo 6, this is Ghost 1 on approach to your position. Please authenticate. Static answered her, filled with electronic noise that spoke of atmospheric interference and perhaps other factors. She tried again, adjusting frequencies and power levels, but received only silence in return. The coordinates were 3 minutes ahead when Ghost made the decision that would define the rest of the mission. She began descending toward the deck, bringing the A-10 down to an altitude that would allow visual identification of targets while exposing the aircraft to every weapon system in the valley. Through the scattered cloud cover, she could make out movement along the ridgelines, figures that could be Taliban fighters positioning for ambush, or shadows created by shifting light and imagination. The uncertainty was maddening, but it was also familiar. Close air support missions often required split-second decisions based on incomplete information and tactical intuition developed through experience. As the A-10 dropped below 500 feet above ground level, Ghost felt the aircraft enter what pilots called the envelope. That altitude range where surface-to-air threats became immediate and deadly, but where the Warthog's weapon systems achieved maximum effectiveness. It was a realm where machine and pilot either worked in perfect harmony or died together. The valley opened before her like pages in a tactical manual, revealing defensive positions, potential landing zones, and the harsh mathematics of small unit combat in terrain that favored the defender. Somewhere in that landscape, 6 Navy SEALs were either fighting for their lives or had already paid the ultimate price for venturing beyond the reach of conventional support. Ghost had 90 seconds to find them, identify threats, and begin the kind of precision close air support that separated professional pilots from merely competent ones. In 90 seconds, she would discover whether her reputation for flying impossible missions was earned or merely the product of favorable circumstances and better weather. The radio crackled one final time before atmospheric conditions claimed it entirely. Ghost, this is Rodriguez, taking heavy fire, North Ridge, danger close. Then silence, complete, unforgiving silence that stretched across 43 miles of hostile territory back to forward operating base Shank, where radio operators would mark her status as communications lost and begin calculating search and rescue probabilities that decreased with each passing minute. Ghost was alone now, exactly as Major Davidson had warned, flying an A-10 Thunderbolt II through weather that challenged the aircraft's design parameters toward coordinates where 6 elite warriors waited for help that military doctrine insisted could never arrive. The valley floor rushed toward her at 250 knots, and Ghost began the most important work of her 8-year career. The first thing Ghost noticed was the bodies. They lay scattered across a narrow clearing perhaps 200 meters from the valley's north wall, their positions telling a story of movement under fire and tactical discipline maintained until the end. Even from her altitude of 300 feet, she could distinguish the distinctive gear and positioning that marked them as professional soldiers rather than local fighters. The second thing she noticed was muzzle flashes along the northern ridgeline. Multiple positions, coordinated fields of fire, the kind of prepared ambush that suggested the Taliban fighters had been expecting rescue attempts. Ghost counted at least 8 separate firing positions before atmospheric conditions swallowed visibility again, but the tactical picture was already forming in her mind. The SEALs had been caught in a kill zone with no effective cover and no escape routes. Classical tactics called for immediate extraction or overwhelming fire support, but conventional wisdom also insisted that neither option was available given the terrain and weather conditions. Ghost had approximately 4 minutes of fuel remaining for tactical operations before she would need to begin the return flight to base. 4 minutes to locate survivors, identify threats, and deliver the kind of precision strikes that could shift tactical balance without killing the people she'd come to save. She began her attack run at an angle that would allow the GAU-8 cannon to engage targets along the ridgeline, while minimizing risk to any survivors on the valley floor. The Warthog systems performed exactly as designed, target acquisition displays providing firing solutions that accounted for altitude, airspeed, and the ballistic characteristics of 30mm depleted uranium rounds. The first burst from the GAU-8 sounded like the world's largest zipper being opened at supersonic speed. 2,000 rounds per minute of cannon fire raked across the northern ridgeline, each projectile carrying enough kinetic energy to disable vehicles or destroy fortified positions. The distinctive BRRRRT of the Warthog's main gun echoed off the valley walls, announcing that the tactical equation had fundamentally changed. Return fire came immediately, muzzle flashes from positions that Ghost hadn't detected during her initial reconnaissance. The Taliban fighters had prepared for this moment, positioning anti-aircraft weapons and coordinating their response with the discipline of veterans who understood American close air support tactics. Tracer rounds streaked past the A-10's cockpit, some close enough that Ghost could hear their passage over the engine noise. But the aircraft's design philosophy showed its value now. The titanium bathtub surrounding her position absorbed impacts that would have been catastrophic in lighter aircraft, while redundant systems maintained functionality even as secondary components suffered damage. Ghost rolled the A-10 into a climbing turn that would set up her second attack run, her movements smooth and deliberate despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. 8 years of close air support missions had taught her that panic was more dangerous than enemy fire, and that the best pilots developed an almost meditative calm during the most chaotic moments of combat. During the climbing turn, atmospheric conditions cleared enough for her to glimpse the valley floor again. This time, she saw movement among the bodies, a single figure dragging another toward a shallow depression that offered minimal cover from the elevated firing positions. Survivors, at least 2, possibly more if others were maintaining concealment in positions she couldn't detect from her current angle. The radio crackled with interference, but buried in the static she thought she heard a human voice. Ghost adjusted frequencies and power settings, desperate to re-establish communication with anyone on the ground who could provide target identification and coordinate her attacks. Ghost 1, this is Rodriguez. The transmission faded in and out of clarity, but the relief in the voice was unmistakable. Confirmed friendly, southeast corner, targets on North Ridge. Ghost keyed her microphone, hoping the transmission would penetrate atmospheric interference. Rodriguez, this is Ghost 1. I have visual on your position. How many survivors? Static answered her, but she thought she detected 2 clicks. The universal radio signal for affirmative response when voice communication wasn't possible. 2 survivors. 4 casualties. The mathematics of small unit combat playing out in a valley that conventional wisdom had declared unreachable. Ghost lined up for her second attack run, this time approaching from a different angle to engage firing positions that had revealed themselves during the first pass. The AGM-65 Maverick missiles on her outer pylons would be ideal for hardened positions, but their blast radius created danger-close considerations when friendlies were located within the target area. Instead, she opted for precision cannon fire, using the A-10's targeting systems to engage individual positions with short, controlled bursts that maximize destruction of enemy assets while minimizing risk to survivors. The technique required flying closer to the target area, accepting increased exposure to ground fire in exchange for surgical accuracy. The second attack run achieved everything she'd hoped for and revealed everything she'd feared. Her cannon fire eliminated 3 confirmed enemy positions along the northern ridgeline, the distinctive explosions and secondary detonations indicating successful strikes against prepared fighting positions. But the return fire was heavier now, more coordinated, suggesting that additional fighters had moved into the area during the brief interval between attacks. The Taliban had anticipated rescue attempts and prepared accordingly. This wasn't a chance encounter or opportunistic ambush. It was a carefully planned trap designed to destroy American rescue assets while eliminating the SEAL team that had ventured too far beyond conventional support. Ghost felt impacts against the A-10's airframe, the distinctive metallic impacts that indicated successful hits from small arms fire. Warning lights flickered on her instrument panel, system alerts that she acknowledged without allowing them to distract from her tactical focus. The Warthog had been designed to absorb exactly this kind of punishment and continue fighting. But fuel was becoming critical, and atmospheric conditions continued deteriorating. She had perhaps 90 seconds remaining for tactical operations before she would need to begin the return flight or risk becoming stranded in hostile territory herself. 90 seconds to extract 2 survivors from a valley that had already claimed 4 lives and threatened to claim more. Ghost began her third and final attack run with the understanding that everything depended on the next 60 seconds of flying. This pass would either create an opportunity for the survivors to escape or result in her joining them in the valley permanently. She armed all remaining weapon systems and began her descent toward the most dangerous airspace in Afghanistan. The third attack run began at an altitude that military doctrine classified as suicidal. Ghost brought the A-10 down to 75 feet above the valley floor, low enough to see individual rocks and the expressions on enemy fighters' faces as they tracked her approach. At this altitude, every weapon system in the valley became a potential threat, but it also meant that her own weapons achieved maximum effectiveness against targets that had no effective cover. The Maverick missiles left their pylons in rapid succession, their guidance systems locking onto the 2 largest concentrations of enemy fire along the northern ridgeline. Ghost watched their flight paths through her targeting display, twin streaks of precision destruction that would either eliminate the primary threats or reveal the full extent of Taliban preparations. The first missile impacted a fortified position carved into the ridgeline itself, the explosion sending rock fragments and weapon components in all directions. The second found what appeared to be an ammunition cache, producing secondary explosions that continued for nearly 15 seconds and illuminated additional fighting positions that had remained hidden. But the real revelation came from the return fire. Instead of the sporadic small arms fire she'd encountered during previous passes, Ghost now faced coordinated anti-aircraft fire from multiple positions. Tracer rounds formed deadly patterns in the air around her aircraft, while heavier weapons, probably 23 anti-aircraft guns, sent streams of projectiles that could disable the A-10's engines or flight controls. The Taliban hadn't just prepared for rescue attempts. They'd prepared specifically for American close air support aircraft, positioning weapons and coordinating fields of fire with the expertise of fighters who understood air power and knew how to counter it. Ghost felt the A-10 shudder as multiple rounds found their target. Warning lights cascaded across her instrument panel, system failures that she cataloged mentally while maintaining focus on her primary mission. The right engine showed temperature spikes indicating possible damage, while hydraulic pressure warnings suggested impacts against critical flight systems. But the Warthog continued flying, its design philosophy vindicated by circumstances that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Ghost used her remaining cannon ammunition in a series of strafing runs that suppressed enemy fire long enough for her to glimpse the survivor's position again. Two figures, definitely alive, definitely moving with purpose rather than the random motion of panic. One appeared to be providing covering fire while the other prepared for movement. Classic tactical discipline that suggested both survivors retained their combat effectiveness despite casualties and isolation. The radio crackled one final time, Chief Rodriguez's voice emerging from static with crystal clarity. "Ghost One, we're ready for extraction. Can you provide cover for movement to the southeast landing zone?" Ghost checked her tactical display and immediately understood the problem. The southeastern area of the valley offered the only terrain suitable for helicopter landing, but it was also exposed to the surviving enemy positions along the northern ridgeline. Any extraction attempt would require continuous close air support to suppress enemy fire during the most vulnerable phases of rescue operations. But her fuel state had reached critical levels, and her aircraft had sustained damage that made extended operations increasingly dangerous. She had perhaps 60 seconds of combat capability remaining before she would need to begin the return flight or risk crashing in hostile territory. "Rodriguez, this is Ghost One," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the tactical impossibility of the situation. "I'm Winchester on missiles and critically low on fuel. Cannot maintain extended cover for extraction operations." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Ghost could almost see Chief Rodriguez and his surviving teammate calculating probabilities, weighing options that ranged from unlikely to impossible. When the SEAL chief's voice returned, it carried the calm acceptance of professional warriors who understood the mathematics of their situation. "Understood, Ghost One. We'll hold position and await alternative rescue coordination." Ghost knew what that meant. Without immediate extraction, and with their position compromised, the two survivors would likely not see another dawn. The Taliban fighters would use darkness to maneuver closer, overwhelming the SEALs' remaining defensive capabilities through simple arithmetic, numbers and ammunition favoring the attackers. She could return to base, report the situation, and recommend follow-up missions that might or might not receive authorization depending on weather conditions and risk assessments. By military standards, she had already exceeded mission parameters and achieved more than conventional wisdom had deemed possible. But Ghost had not become the most effective close air support pilot in her squadron. By accepting conventional wisdom or abandoning missions, when tactical conditions became challenging. She made a decision that violated regulations, exceeded her authority, and redefined the parameters of what constituted reasonable risk in combat operations. "Rodriguez," she transmitted, her voice carrying new determination, "mark your position with whatever signaling device you have. I'm declaring emergency fuel status and conducting immediate landing in your vicinity." The radio silence that followed was different from before, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of disbelief. Ghost had just announced her intention to land an A-10 Thunderbolt II in terrain that helicopter pilots had declared unsuitable for extraction operations. Landing an A-10 Thunderbolt II in a narrow valley, under enemy fire, wasn't covered in any training manual Ghost had ever studied. The southeast section of the valley offered approximately 800 meters of relatively flat terrain, just barely adequate for an aircraft designed for short field operations, but only under ideal conditions with no external pressures. Ghost was attempting the maneuver with battle damage, critically low fuel, and active enemy positions maintaining overwatch of the improvised landing zone. She began her approach at an angle that would minimize exposure to the remaining Taliban positions while giving her the longest possible landing roll. The A-10's design characteristics that made it effective for close air support, heavy weight, high wing loading, and powerful engines, created significant challenges for unconventional landing operations. At 200 feet above ground level, Ghost extended landing gear and configured the aircraft for minimum approach speed. Warning lights continued cascading across her instrument panel, but the primary flight controls remained responsive despite obvious damage to secondary systems. The Warthog's reputation for surviving battle damage was about to face its ultimate test. Through her cockpit windscreen, Ghost could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions along the northern ridgeline. The Taliban fighters had quickly adapted to her changed tactics, repositioning to engage a stationary target rather than a fast-moving aircraft. Their fire would become increasingly accurate as her airspeed decreased during the landing phase. The radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice. "Ghost 1, we have visual on your approach, marking position with infrared strobe. Be advised, taking intermittent sniper fire from multiple positions." Ghost acknowledged the transmission while fighting crosswinds that threatened to push the A-10 toward the valley walls. At this altitude and airspeed, even minor course corrections required careful control inputs to avoid stalling the aircraft or impacting terrain that offered no margin for error. 50 feet above the valley floor, she could see the two SEAL survivors clearly for the first time. Both men were positioned behind improvised cover, their weapons trained on the ridgelines while maintaining awareness of her approach. Even in their desperate tactical situation, they maintained the professionalism and fire discipline that marked them as elite warriors. The A-10's main landing gear touched down on terrain that had never been designed for aircraft operations. Rock and loose soil created a landing roll that tested every component of the landing gear system, while subjecting Ghost to deceleration forces that pushed the limits of her restraint system. But the aircraft held together, coming to a complete stop approximately 50 meters from the survivor's position, with both engines still operating and flight controls still responsive. Ghost had successfully landed an A-10 Thunderbolt II in terrain that conventional wisdom insisted was impossible to reach. The celebration lasted exactly 3 seconds before Taliban fighters began concentrating fire on the stationary aircraft. Rounds impacted the A-10's armored surfaces with increasing frequency, some penetrating secondary systems, while others deflected harmlessly off the titanium bathtub that protected the cockpit area. Ghost could hear the distinctive sounds of different weapon systems engaging her position: small arms fire, machine guns, and at least one heavier weapon that might have been a recoilless rifle. She keyed her radio while unbuckling her restraint system. "Rodriguez, I'm dismounting. We need to establish defensive perimeter and coordinate immediate extraction before they bring up heavier weapons. Ghost opened the A-10's canopy and immediately understood that the tactical situation was worse than radio communications had suggested. The valley echoed with weapons fire from multiple directions, while smoke and dust from her missile strikes created visibility problems that favored defenders familiar with the terrain. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez appeared at her aircraft's wing route, moving with the controlled urgency of someone operating under fire. His tactical gear was torn and blood-stained, while his face carried the exhaustion of warriors who had been fighting for their lives over an extended period. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying respect that transcended normal military protocol, "this is Petty Officer Thompson. We've been holding position for 6 hours against approximately 20 Taliban fighters. 4 KIA, 2 WIA. Thompson took shrapnel in his left arm but remains combat effective." Ghost nodded, already assessing their tactical options while retrieving survival gear from the A-10's equipment bay. The aircraft's survival radio would provide communication with rescue coordination centers, while her personal weapons would supplement the SEAL's defensive capabilities during what would likely be an extended engagement. "Extraction possibilities?" she asked. Rodriguez pointed toward the valley's eastern wall, where the terrain offered a potential escape route that would require climbing exposed slopes under enemy observation. "We've identified 3 possible routes, but all require movement across open terrain under direct fire. With Thompson wounded and our ammunition situation critical, movement becomes increasingly difficult." Ghost understood the tactical mathematics. 3 individuals against 20, limited ammunition, no effective cover, and enemy forces holding elevated positions with excellent fields of fire. By conventional standards, their situation was hopeless. But Ghost had not violated regulations and landed her aircraft in impossible terrain to accept conventional conclusions about hopeless situations. She activated the survival radio and began coordinating with rescue forces that had probably given them up for dead hours earlier. Her aircraft might be temporarily grounded, but its radio equipment remained functional, and forward operating base Shank was still within communication range. Shank Base, this is Ghost 1. Emergency extraction required at previous coordinates. 3 souls on site, enemy contact ongoing. Request immediate combat search and rescue coordination." The response came immediately, Major Davidson's voice carrying disbelief and something approaching anger. "Ghost 1, confirm your status. Our tracking shows your aircraft stationary at the target coordinates." "Confirmed, Shank Base. Aircraft is grounded but operational. We have 2 SEAL survivors plus myself requiring immediate extraction. Enemy force estimated at 20 fighters with prepared positions and heavy weapons." The radio silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds, long enough for Ghost to understand that her decision to land had created command problems that extended far beyond simple rescue coordination. When Davidson's voice returned, it carried resignation and determination in equal measure. "Ghost 1, we're coordinating full combat search and rescue operations. ETA approximately 90 minutes. Maintain defensive positions and preserve ammunition for final defensive fires." 90 minutes. Against 20 Taliban fighters with prepared positions, superior numbers, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Ghost looked at Rodriguez and Thompson, both men already preparing defensive positions with the methodical efficiency of professionals who understood that the next 90 minutes would determine whether they lived to see another sunset. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said quietly, "want to tell us how you managed to land that beast in terrain that grounded every helicopter in the inventory?" Ghost checked her personal weapon and surveyed their defensive positions one final time before answering. "Chief, Sometimes impossible is just another word for unprofessional. The sound of incoming mortar rounds eliminated any opportunity for further conversation. The first mortar round impacted 30 meters from their position, sending rock fragments and shrapnel in all directions, while announcing that the Taliban fighters had brought indirect fire capabilities into the engagement. Ghost threw herself behind the improvised stone barrier that Rodriguez and Thompson had constructed, feeling the concussion wave pass over their position like a physical presence. 82 mm mortars, Thompson called out, his voice steady despite the blood seeping through bandages on his left arm. At least 2 tubes, probably positioned on the reverse slope of the eastern ridge. Ghost understood immediately. Indirect fire weapons changed the tactical equation fundamentally. Their defensive positions, adequate against direct fire weapons, provided minimal protection against mortars that could deliver explosive rounds in high-arcing trajectories. The Taliban fighters were methodically working to eliminate the survivors through systematic bombardment while maintaining safe distances from American defensive fires. The second mortar round landed closer, perhaps 20 meters from their position. Ghost felt the ground tremor beneath her as fragments whistled overhead with lethal velocity. The enemy mortar crews were adjusting their fires based on observed impacts, following procedures that suggested professional military training rather than improvised tactics. Rate of fire indicates experienced crews, Rodriguez observed, maintaining his sector of observation even as additional mortar rounds impacted around their position. They're walking rounds toward us using standard adjustment procedures. Ghost activated her survival radio, hopping to coordinate immediate fire support from aircraft that might be operating in adjacent areas. But atmospheric conditions continued degrading, and her transmissions generated only static responses that indicated communication links to higher headquarters remained unreliable. The third mortar round landed close enough to shower their position with debris and fill the air with dust that reduced visibility to mere meters. Ghost could hear secondary fragments impacting her A-10's armored surfaces, each strike reminding her that their